In a quiet Kentucky town, tragedy wasn't uncommon. But this time, it wasn't just the loss of a young life that sent shockwaves through the community. It was the whispers, the haunting question that no one could answer. Why did her mother just stand there? Elena Matthews was only 2 years old when her life was cut short, brutally, senselessly. But the story doesn't end with her death, it begins there. And at the center of it all stood her mother, Margaret, silent, unmoving, and unbroken. What would drive a mother to watch as her daughter was destroyed? Fear? Denial? Or something much darker? Think about it. If you saw someone you loved being hurt, would you risk everything to stop it? Or would you look away? Before we dive into this harrowing story of silence, betrayal, and tragedy, make sure you subscribe to our channel, Just Dark Crimes, for more gripping true crime stories. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an update. In the quiet, unassuming town of Shepherdsville, Kentucky, where neighbors know each other's names, whispers of tragedy ripple through the community like wildfire. The air is heavy as mourners gather beneath a slate-gray sky, their faces etched with a mix of grief, confusion, and unspoken questions. The casket before them holds the body of 2-year-old Elena Carter, a child whose life was brutally cut short. But as the pastor speaks of love and forgiveness, the crowd's thoughts shifts, not to the boyfriend who'd often flaunted his control over Elena, or even his friends known for their rowdy, menacing presence, but to her own mother, Margaret Carter. Could a mother really stand by and watch her only child's life unravel so tragically? What kind of silence lets cruelty thrive unchecked? Elena's death wasn't just a loss, it was a storm that unearthed buried secrets and ignited suspicion. Some called it negligence, others whispered of guilt. But no one had answers, only one question: why didn't Margaret do anything to stop it? As the mourners shuffle away, their voices turn into hushed murmurs. A few daring glances land on Margaret, standing still by the casket, her face unreadable in her prison uniform. Was it grief, guilt, or something crazier? Today we uncover the chilling story of Elena Carter's life and the silent witness who stood by and did nothing. Let me tell you a bit about Elena first. She was the kind of person who could light up a room just by walking into it. Kind-hearted, always smiling. The kind of girl who made you feel better just by being around her. She was only 2, full of a bright future and a breath of fresh air. You see, Elena had always been a bright, curious 2-year-old. She loved to explore, always following Margaret around the house with tiny giggles and wide, wondering eyes. But when Jason entered their lives, everything began to change. Jason was charming at first, helpful even. He'd pick Elena up, twirl her around, and make her laugh like she hadn't in months. For a moment it almost seemed like he cared. But Jason? He wasn't what he seemed. Now let's talk about Margaret, Elena's mother. Or maybe guardian is a better word, because the truth is, Margaret often felt more like a bystander than a parent. She was quiet, withdrawn, the kind of woman who always seemed overwhelmed by life. Some said she'd had a rough past, a trail of broken relationships, a string of bad decisions. Others whispered that she had always been weak, too afraid to confront the things that needed fixing. But here's the question: does Margaret's past excuse her from protecting her child? Then there was Jason's crowd. His friends, if you could call them that. A loud, reckless bunch, always taking over Margaret's house. They'd sit on the couch, feet up on the coffee table, acting like they owned the place. Elena would toddle around, looking for a safe space amidst their shouting and roughhousing. But there was no safe space. At first, it was little things. Jason's friends were loud, careless, drinking, swearing, throwing things around. But over time, it escalated. The way they looked at Elena wasn't right. The way they spoke to her wasn't right. And Jason? He didn't just allow it. He encouraged it. And Margaret? She saw it all. She'd stand in the kitchen, her hands trembling as she held a dishcloth, watching through the doorway as Jason and his friends grew crueler by the day. And yet, she said nothing. Not a word. Why didn't she step in? Was she paralyzed by fear, her own trauma holding her back? Or was her silence something else, something darker? So tell me, what do you think? Is fear an excuse, or a choice? As the abuse escalated, her silence grew louder. Day after day, Margaret seemed to shrink further into herself, watching everything unfold but never stepping in. Was Margaret frozen by fear, or did she choose to ignore what was happening? At first, Jason seemed like a blessing for Elena. He gave her the attention she'd always craved, someone to lean on in a world that often felt too lonely. But it didn't take long for things to change. Jason wasn't just charming, he was calculating. Slowly but surely, he started cutting her off from everyone who mattered. Friends? Gone. Family? pushed away. He wanted their world to revolve around him, and only him. He wouldn't let her go for play dates or even let her go for sleepovers. He wouldn't let her grandparents visit either. And then came Jason's friends. They were always around, filling the house with noise, chaos, and something much darker. At first, they just mocked Elena, snide comments, teasing that didn't feel like teasing. But over time it got worse. They treated her like a joke, or worse, like she didn't matter. Imagine being in your own home, surrounded by people who see you as nothing more than their plaything. That was Elena's reality. And where was Margaret in all of this? Right there. She saw it all. She heard the yelling, the insults, the way Jason controlled every move Elena made. And she did nothing. What? Was it fear? Guilt? Or something else? Some say Margaret's silence came from her past. They say she'd lived through her own abuse, that she'd learned to survive by keeping her head down and staying quiet. But does surviving your own pain mean you get to ignore someone else's? Especially when that someone is your own daughter. Elena knew something was wrong. She could feel her world crumbling around her. One night she finally worked up to her mother. She begged Margaret for help, tears streaming down her face as she poured her heart out. "Mummy, I don't like Jason." And you know what Margaret did? She made excuses. "Jason isn't that bad. You'll be fine. You just need to see him as your new daddy." Can you imagine what that must have felt like? To cry out for help and be met with apathy, or worse, indifference? But the worst moment came not long after. Jason was furious about something. Who even knows what? He started yelling, his voice echoing through the house. And then he hit her. And Margaret? She was standing right there. She saw it happen, looked at her daughter, and then just turned and walked away. What do you even do with that? Was Margaret so broken by her past that she couldn't face the present? Or was it easier to pretend she didn't see anything at all? The night it all came to a head. It started like so many others. Jason decided to throw a party at the house. His friends came over, loud and rowdy as always, turning the place into their personal playground. Tried to stay out of the way. She always did. But when you're trapped in the middle of the storm, there's only so far you can run. They started with the usual taunts, jabs, cruel laughter. But that night something was different. Elena, a little girl, had enough. She cried, she pushed back. She stood up for herself in her own little way. "Leave me alone," she cried. And Jason? He didn't like that. Not one bit. The room turned tense, heavy, like the air had been sucked out. Jason's anger ignited like a spark to dry timber. He grabbed her arm, his voice rising above the music and chatter. His friends egged him on like this was all some kind of sick game. Elena fought back. She tried to break free, to hold on to the small shred of dignity she had left. But it wasn't enough. What happened next? No one outside that house will ever fully know. But here's what we do know. Margaret stood in the hallway just a few steps away. She saw them dragging Elena into the living room, heard the shouting, the sound of fists meeting flesh. Elena crying out in pain. And Margaret? She just stood there, frozen, watching. Elena fell to the ground, her body crumpled and still. One of Jason's friends laughed. It was the kind of laugh that made your stomach turn. And Margaret? She didn't rush in. She didn't yell for them to stop. She didn't call for help. She didn't even call 911. Instead, she quietly turned, walked to her bedroom and closed the door. Now, I want you to think about that for a second. Can you imagine hearing your child's cries fade into silence? Knowing what's happening, and choosing to walk away? Why did she do it? Was she afraid? Was she numb? Or was it something else entirely? The next morning, the house was eerily quiet. The party was over, the guests long gone. Margaret walked into the living room to find Elena lying there, motionless, lifeless. She rushed her to the hospital, but it was too late. Her daughter, her own flesh and blood, was gone. And yet, Margaret didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply stood there, staring at what was left of the bright, kind-hearted young woman she once knew. So, what do you think? Was Margaret a victim of her own fear, or was she complicit in her silence? Word of Elena's death spread like wildfire through the small Kentucky town. People whispered about it in the grocery store, at church, on front porches as the sun dipped below the horizon. But the whispers weren't just about the tragedy itself. No, they were about Margaret. How could a mother let this happen? Did she know what Jason and his friends were doing? Did she do anything to stop it? At first, it seemed like Jason and his friends had vanished without a trace, scattering the moment things went too far. But the police didn't give up. They combed through every inch of Margaret's house, determined to piece together the horrific puzzle. And then they found it, DNA evidence. Jason and his friends had left behind more than they realized, traces of their presence that tied them directly to Elena's death. Coupled with testimonies from neighbors about the loud, violent behavior in the house and Margaret's eerie silence, a case began to form. Margaret, too, was brought in for questioning. At first, she claimed she didn't know what was happening, that she was too scared to act. But the evidence told a different story. It became clear that Margaret had known about the abuse, had witnessed the violence, and had done nothing to stop it. The trial was a spectacle. The courtroom overflowed with spectators, hungry for answers and justice. Jason and his friends sat stone-faced as prosecutors outlined their brutality. Witnesses described the chaos of that house, the toxic atmosphere Jason and his crew had created, and Margaret's failure to intervene. When Margaret took the stand, she was pale and visibly shaken. She spoke of fear, of being overwhelmed, and of not knowing how to protect Elena. But her words rang hollow in the face of the evidence. The jury deliberated for hours before returning their verdicts. Jason and his friends were found guilty of murder. They were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, their acts deemed nothing short of monstrous. And Margaret? The court acknowledged her role too. She was convicted of criminal negligence and being a party to the crime. The judge, while acknowledging her fear and troubled past, made it clear that her inaction was inexcusable. She was sentenced to 15 years in prison. The aftermath of the trial sent shockwaves through the small town. This wasn't just a tragedy for one family, it was a stain on the entire community. People who once turned a blind eye to the noise coming from Margaret's house now wrestled with their own guilt. Neighbors who'd suspected something was wrong but said nothing began to question themselves. Could they have saved Elena if they'd spoken up sooner? Church sermons turned somber, with pastors urging their congregations to look out for one another, to speak up against abuse, and to stop hiding behind small-town politeness. Schools and community groups organized events on child welfare and recognizing the signs of abuse. Flyers about domestic violence hotlines appeared on every notice board in town. But the weight of what happened lingered. Parents looked at their own children differently, holding them a little tighter at night. Friends who once greeted Margaret on the street with a smile now avoided even mentioning her name. And the house where Elena died? It became a symbol of neglect, a silent reminder of the consequences of inaction. The house is empty now. Abandoned. The toys that once brought laughter now sit untouched, gathering dust in the corners of a house filled with echoes of the past. In her prison cell, Margaret stares out a small window, her gaze distant. The years stretch ahead of her, but it's not the prison walls that confine her, it's the weight of her guilt. She sees Elena everywhere. In her dreams. In the faint echoes of her laughter that ring in her mind. And sometimes she whispers to herself, replaying the same questions over and over. What if she'd been stronger? What if she'd called for help? What if she'd done the one thing Elena needed her to do, be a mother? But the answers never come. Only the memories remain. There's no greater prison than guilt. Thank you for watching. If this story made you think about the importance of speaking out about the consequences of silence, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss more stories like this. See you next time, on Just Dark.